Alrighty guys, it is Qaaman here today, and we are continuing the Miami Heat San Antonio Spurs finals recap. And we're moving on to the very next segment of our six-part segment where we talk about why did the Miami Heat lose. So we just recently finished talking about all of the things that the Spurs did to win. Let's think about all of the negative things that may have hurt the Miami Heat's chances of doing a three-peat. So James, would you like to start off?
I would have to say that the best thing that I can come up with is something that you actually said, is that the Heat didn't make enough changes early enough in the series. Like, when they got down, when they lost that first game by a big margin, I know LeBron not playing the final 5-6 minutes hurt them, but they could have made other adjustments, because when LeBron was out, they just did not really do anything. And you figure, could they have possibly, switched their lineup a little differently a little bit earlier? But also I'd like to say is that I think this also has to deal with the offseason, because if you look at what the Spurs do in the offseason, they analyze their roster entirely to make sure there's no dead weight and that everybody can contribute. Then when you look at the Heat, they have the big three, they get a few support players and call it a really big, they're not as adept as much as the Spurs in making sure everybody has a place. So I think that might have had to do with the fact they didn't have the depth the Spurs did.
Well, James, I know that you're a Spurs fan and I'm a Heat fan, but I want us, as a Spurs fan, by the way, guys, just to let you know, for those of you who are watching this, me and James are trying our absolute best not to be biased, because trust me, we're trying to be fair here, because we both hate each other's teams. Especially, I respect the Spurs, but I just hate that they beat us so bad. But what would you honestly say about the Miami Heat outside of the big three? Like, how would you analyze their players really briefly? Just looking at, the chart.
I would have to say that their best player outside of the big three is Ray Allen, and he's 38 years old. I mean, I'm not trying to say that he's like this ancient grandpa that should retire tomorrow, but what I am saying is that if you have guys like LeBron, Dwayne Wade, and Chris Bosh who have contracts where you can opt out of, you might want to get some insurance to make sure that you've got some game in case they go. You know what I'm saying? Also, the fact that their current depth right now, if you look at the players in the series between the Spurs and the Heat, let's look at their point per game totals. Yes, you've got the big three, and then we got Ray Allen. Michael Beasley played, I believe, one game, had 9 points. Rashard Lewis averaged 8.5 points a game. Mario Chalmers, 4 points a game. You look at the Spurs, more points.
Well, James, you kind of touched on it right there, and I kind of want to expand on this because, I think one thing that we did wrong, honestly, and I love the guy, he's been playing with the team the whole career, but let's be honest, in the NBA today, what's the most competitive position that is loaded with the most talent right now in the NBA? The point guard position.
Exactly.
Let's be honest, the best players are probably small forwards, but the most competitive position is point guard, because you got guys like Chris Paul, a healthy Derrick Rose, Russell Westbrook, Damian Lillard, John Wall, Rajon Rondo, Tony Parker,
Steph Curry.
Brandon Jennings is not garbage. He's not a great player, but he's decent. Monte Ellis is not garbage. He's decent. If you're looking at all of these mediocre point guards that are already that good, Darren Williams, I can talk about good point guards all day, and I'm sure somebody is going to find a point guard that I didn't mention and say it in the comments below. All of those competitive point guards are, really making a lot of franchises better. And let's be honest, the Spurs have a solid franchise point guard in Tony Parker. And I think point guard play had to do as a major factor in why we lost. What would you have to say about that?
It's a big reason, because Parker did have a couple games he went over 20, but if you look at the rest of the series, when he wasn't scoring a whole lot, he was being a big time veteran leader on the court.
Definitely. And when you really look at when you really look at the entirety of the series, Tony Parker still averaged 18 points a game. All right, his assist percentage went down a little bit. This wasn't the best series for Tony Parker, let's be honest. But he did shoot 41%, almost 42% from three. That was actually pretty impressive considering Tony Parker isn't really much of a three-point threat. He hit 12 threes throughout the finals, and he hit 12 for 15. That's excellent. I mean, I'm sorry, 5 for 12. I don't know why I saw 12 for 15. I was looking at another stat column, but he went 5 for 12 from three-point range, and that's pretty impressive considering Tony Parker's never really been much of a three-point shooter. And you also factor in that Tony Parker did a lot of the other things too. I mean, what Tony Parker really does is he facilitates an offense without really having assists. And a lot of people, when they don't really understand basketball, they tend to think that a good point guard has to get a bunch of assists. Well, that's partially true. It's nice to have a point guard who gets a lot of assists, but to facilitate an offense doesn't necessarily mean you always have to be the guy who got the assist. Tony Parker starts the motion of the San Antonio machine that generates a lot of great passes to get open guys' shots. And I think, that really helped the Spurs and that wasn't something the Miami Heat really had from Mario Chalmers, since, the Heat are the subject here. I mean, Chalmers averaged 2.8 assists per game. That's pretty poor.
Yeah, he was clearly the inferior of the 2 point guards in this series.
Right. He had.
Honestly, my opinion is this. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say. Chalmers had 14 assists to only 10 turnovers, and that's a pretty high assist turnover ratio for a point guard. That's pretty. He has a lot of turnovers per assist.
If you look at the teams in the NBA that generally have some of the better offenses. LA be one of them. I'm talking about the Clippers. Chris Paul's a big part of that. Steph Curry's a big part of his team's success in Golden State. The point guard position with the big three Miami has almost become an afterthought. It really has. And you figure out a team that scores that much, that has that much talent, that they would have a better option at that position.
Also, let's factor something else out that the Miami Heat didn't necessarily have. Chris Bosh. Let's talk about Bosh a little bit here. Chris Bosh, for the series, he averaged 14 points, 5 rebounds a game, 0.2 blocks, and there's 5 games, which means he got 1 block throughout the whole series, if we know a little bit of math, 1 assist. That's very pedestrian for a third option on any team. I mean, and considering that Dwayne Wade, obviously didn't play up to his standards, Chris Bosh really underperformed, in my opinion. He could have done a lot more. Now, why does Chris Bosh have so so few rebounds per game? Why is it that he's 6'11", almost 7 feet, and he only averages that? And the fact that a guy like Chris Anderson, who plays significantly less minutes, averages more rebounds? Well, Chris Bosh plays center, and he's really a power forward, so he's playing against bigger, stronger guys in the post, and he has harder times grabbing rebounds against those guys. Also, it's also positioning too. It's not just that Chris Bosh is, he's not in, part of the reason is he's not in the post. I mean, James, I'm sure you remember a lot of the positioning that Chris Bosh was in. He was on the perimeter a lot.
And that's not really where his skills are best either. Not at all. He's too big a guy to be on the perimeter. I mean, he should be inside, trying to get more layup.
I mean, to be honest, you should only be on the perimeter as a big man if you're as good as a three-point shooter as, let's say, a Dirk Nowitzki. I don't mind Dirk Nowitzki being on the three-point line. But a guy like Bosh, who's a mediocre three-point shooter, it's not that great. Now, for the series, he actually shot pretty decent from three. He shot 38.5%, 5 for 13. That's actually pretty good, considering 35% is a decent three-point shooting rating. But Bosh really didn't play up to expectations, and on the defensive end, Tim Duncan looked like he was 10 years younger. And if you actually compare the ages between Bosh and Tim Duncan, it's almost 10 years apart. I mean, Tim Duncan's 38 and Chris Bosh is 29. So there's a big age gap between Bosh and Duncan. They're on completely different spectrums of their careers. I definitely think Bosh could have played better, and obviously we have to include him in this conversation here. Dwayne Wade, I've said it several times in the other videos. He's my favorite player. He averaged 15 points per game, shot 44% from the field, whereas in the regular season he shot 55%. He shot 33% from three, which is actually high for him because Wade isn't really much of a three-point shooter. He shot 69% from free throws, which is below average for him. Wade had a pretty bad series.
He didn't play as well as the previous year or the year before that against the Oklahoma City Thunder either.
Right, and, you know, a lot of people are going to factor in injuries, but I'll say that as a Heat fan, one thing that really stood out about Wade's statistics, James, and I'm sure you're looking at the stat sheet too, Wade had 13 assists to 18 turnovers throughout the series. LeBron James had 20 assists to 19 turnovers. Let's look at Chris Bosh. 5-4.
They weren't being nearly as they weren't being team oriented. They were just getting the ball and trying to shoot or trying to be aggressive. They weren't passing it and creating lanes and opportunities like the Spurs did.
Well, James, when you really analyze all of these statistics, I'm sure that we can both agree that looking at all the stats that we looked at before we made this video, the stat that sticks out the most for the Miami Heat in comparison to the San Antonio Spurs would be the assist to the turnover ratio. The Miami Heat had 76 assists in this series, and they had 72 turnovers, which means the Heat only had 4 more assists than turnovers. The Miami Heat were a turnover machine this series. If you compare that with the San Antonio Spurs, the San Antonio Spurs had 67 turnovers, which means that they didn't take care of the ball much better than we did. However, they had 127 assists.
They were moving it all around the court.
And, you know, I think our lack of ball movement has to do with it. But the thing is James, if we have to think of the biggest reason why the Heat lost to San Antonio, obviously, you know, people are going to say the Spurs were a better team, which they were. But honestly, I really agree with your whole, you know, battle-hardened theory here, because looking at the Miami Heat, they rested Wade 28 games throughout the regular season. You know, there were some nights where LeBron could have played and the Heat rested him. I mean, even though LeBron still had a big workload. The Miami Heat, let's be honest, they kind of coasted through the regular season. They kind of knew that it was going to be them and Indiana because the East was so weak, and they really didn't try that hard. And what happens is, though, when you get to the playoffs, your guys are kind of rusty. The Heat just had so much. We're just so much of a better team than the other 3 teams that they played that we really didn't see their flaws until we got to the NBA Finals. And the Spurs truly exposed, you know, Chalmers and Cole, and that's why, you know, we had to make some changes. But what would you honestly say is the biggest number one factor why the Heat lost this?
I think it's just the fact that they hadn't played as good a competition all year as the Spurs had. I think that is really what it boils down to, in the fact that weaker teams, and other than the big 3, nobody on that team played well. And you can make an argument that LeBron was really did not play a bad series in the final, but at the same time, you look at, there were absences where he kind of played, you know, kind of average, like after the first quarter in Game 5. And also, you have to look at the fact that Spurs were getting such big leads in these games. But if I had to pick one reason why the Heat lost this series, I would have to say it's their depth was not as great as San Antonio's.
Right. I think being out-coached by Popovich had to factor in, but I definitely think it's the turnovers. I think turnovers, I mean, looking at the stat sheet, I'm sure you would agree, turnovers are probably, the turnover rate was ridiculous for the Miami Heat. I mean,
it was insane.
You guys just, I mean, our ball movement was so poor compared to you guys. You know, we didn't take care of the ball a lot, and you forced us to play San Antonio's game because, in reality, the Heat were really an older all-around team than the Spurs were, and that's where I honestly think this happened. So, guys, this concludes why we think the Miami Heat lost the series. We're doing a 6-part segment where we're talking about different aspects of this finals. And I hope you guys check us out in the next video. But please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe. And remember, as I always say, to have a great day, guys.